Welcome to Patriots Pulse. I'm your host, John Sarianides. And as always, I'm joined by my partner, WEEI's John Lyons. John, happy Sunday morning.
Yeah, another Sunday closer to the draft and in the NFL offseason, John. Happy to be back with you.
Yeah, same here. And you mentioned another day closer to the draft. It's hard to believe it's 2 weeks away. And,
Yeah,
and, and it's crazy. I mean, it's 3 weeks away. I shouldn't say that. Easter's 2 weeks away. The draft is 3 weeks away. But nonetheless, it's around the corner. So now we're looking at less than 20 days. Of course, this was a busy week with the Patriots. A lot of press conferences on Monday and Tuesday. You had the annual NFL owners meetings down in Palm Beach, Florida. Mike Vrabel met with the media on Monday morning. Owner Robert Kraft met with the media on Tuesday. As far as Vrabel is concerned, a lot of good stuff that came out of that 34-minute session with the local media and some members of the national media as well. For me, John, big takeaway is obviously he continues to reinforce the cultural piece. He talked about that, expectations, free agency, why they signed some of the guys that they signed. He also got into some of the draft prospects. He spoke about Will Campbell as well. What were some things that he said that you took away from that 34-minute session with the media?
the biggest thing I took away 34 minutes, right? How about that? I don't know
Yeah,
if we're going to
he,
see a
he,
lot
he
of.
said he said that's not going to happen again. Of
Yeah,
course, he is your quintessential ball buster, so it's that was good.
yeah. Him talking about them winning March and kind of scoffing at it, I thought was actually a good thing, right? And he's
Yeah,
smart enough to know that, yeah, you can bring in free agents that are good players and you can trade for guys that are good players and you can draft guys that are good players. But what matters is the year-long process of development. And I think he also realizes the draft itself is more significant than free agency. So I know he knows that, and I know we know that he knows that, but I thought it was notable that he kind of scoffed at that notion of winning March because, as we've seen, John, year in and year out, the teams that have big free agency periods, a lot of times it doesn't pay off, or it pays off in the short term. That first year they get a bump, and then they don't really get much of a bump after that. So, and again, I know that he's smart enough to know that, but I thought it was good to see him acknowledge that.
yeah, and I think it's important to acknowledge that because, again, to your point, it's more about what they do in the fall. I mean, it's great that you added all these free agents and you spent all that money. And again, we're not used to seeing that around here. For 20 years, they won with Tom Brady, Bill Belichick, and free agents wanting to come here. Then they had the shopping spree of the spring of 21, and then we haven't seen anything like that since. So it was nice to see them spend that abundant cap space that they had, but you don't win anything this time of year. Now it's up to him and his coaching staff to make these pieces fit and get the most out of them. And I think you bring up a good point. You know, we've seen this through the years, right? The Jacksonville Jaguars, prime example of a franchise that just can't figure it out. And they spend in free agency probably about as much as any team in the league has in recent years, certainly under Shad Khan. They're always active in free agency and they still can't figure it out. So you don't want to end up in a cycle where you're like them, where you're signing all these free agents and you're spending money every offseason, but the pieces aren't fitting and it's not showing up on the field. So that was nice to hear him say that, hey, it's great that we won March, but now we got to go out and win football games. Of course, as I mentioned, he also talked about the draft prospects. I thought some of his comments about Will Campbell are interesting. It's becoming more and more evident that Will Campbell was, I think he was going to be there at 4 regardless. He wasn't going to go in the top 3, but it's becoming more and more likely, I should say, that Travis Hunter and or Abdul Carter are going to be gone. Todd McShay, of course, tweets out yesterday on X that a source close to him told him that the Tennessee Titans had canceled workouts with Carter and Travis Hunter, which means they're going to take Cam Ward at number 1 overall. With that being the case, it doesn't appear the Giants are going to take a quarterback unless it's a total smokescreen. So Hunter and Carter could be gone, which means the Patriots are now staring at either Will Campbell, another offensive tackle, best player available, or they trade down. But I thought his comments about Will Campbell were pretty interesting from the standpoint that, A, he was willing to address Campbell when the question came up, but B, I also think that he has done his best to come out and say, look, we're looking for football players. We're looking for guys that are going to fit in. We're not going to get hung up on wingspan and arm length necessarily if we think the guy can play.
And I would tie that into what Doug Marrone said afterwards when the Patriots assistant coaches were available, and he kind of threw cold water on the concerns about Will Campbell's arm length. He talked about how a guy plays, how a guy uses his arms. And I walked, and he didn't outright say, like, oh, I love Will Campbell and he's a prospect, that I want here. But I walked away from that thinking, this guy really likes Will Campbell. And at the very least, they're putting cold water on those arm length concerns. And it's shaking out to be, I think, a lot more interesting at 4 than maybe we thought originally, because throughout most of the draft process, we've thought, hey, Carter will probably be there at 4 and they'll take him, or they'll get a big haul and they'll take a tackle later. But if Hunter and Carter are both gone, like, you could take Campbell, you could trade down. John, you could talk me into, if they think Kelvin Banks or Josh Simmons are the best tackles, just taking them at 4 if they really like the guy that much, which would be something we have not talked about the entire draft process to this point. So now I think there's, and obviously there's, do they just take Tet McMillan or someone else or Jalen Walker? Who knows? But I think there's a lot more scenarios possible if both of those guys are gone, and it's kind of seems increasingly likely both will be.
Yeah, and again, I've talked to a couple of Patriot fans that said to me, see, this is why they needed to lose that Buffalo game. Now they're in a tough spot. They fell to 4th, and now they're going to miss out on an impact player. Not necessarily. I don't think they're going to miss out on an impact player. Other thing to keep in mind here is Elliot Wolf did say earlier this offseason that they're going to take the best player available. If that is true, and it's hard to believe this time of year because it's lying season, if in fact that is true, though, then you can make an argument for some other guys. You mentioned Tet McMillan, Tyler Warren, the tight end out of Penn State, could potentially be in play there. There are other players there that fit that best player available moniker that you could take there. And Austin Genty's another one. I know that sounds crazy and it's highly unlikely, but he also fits that category of
He
best
technically probably would be the best player available at 4. I mean, I know it's a running back position, but if you're just matching it up, he probably would be the best player available if both of those guys are gone.
And again, I think a lot of it comes down to Shedeur Sanders, because if he gets past the Giants at 3, now if you hang a for sale sign on that pick and you start calling around the league in the next couple of weeks saying, hey, we're open for business, which I'm sure they've already done. But if that becomes increasingly likely that they are open for business at 4 and Sanders is sitting there, I don't see Shedeur Sanders slipping out of the top 10. I don't see an Aaron Rodgers-esque slide here. I just don't. I think we're living in a different time now than 2005. The social media hype machine helps draft prospects, and I think it's going to help a guy like him. Could he fall out of the top 10 and, let's say, land somewhere between 11 and 15? Yes, but I do not see him falling out of the top 15, we'll say. That's his floor, in my opinion. I still think he goes in the top 10. I still think that if he's sitting there at 4, a team like the Raiders with Brady involved there, obviously his relationship and his friendship with Vrabel, I could see that phone call coming in. Patriots move down 2 spots, pick up another day 2 pick, possibly a future pick. They let them move up. They take Sanders. The Patriots add to their war chest, and they can continue to rebuild this roster. And I do think if, let's say, Hunter and Carter are gone, that's going to become increasingly likely anyway. So I'm glad that Vrabel and Marrone, I'm glad you mentioned Marrone. I'm glad they addressed those things. I still think, in my opinion, I know this is an unpopular opinion, John, and we're going to talk about it the next couple of weeks ad nauseum. I still think if you can take an impact player there like a Will Campbell, you do it. Even if you have to kick him inside the left guard in a year or two, do it at that point, because I still think he's going to be a good player.
Yeah, and I think the thing to remember is Will Campbell, I believe, is going to be a really good to great NFL player. Now, the career-defining question, is that going to be a tackle? Is that going to be a guard? But at one of those spots, the dude's going to be a great player. And I think that's something that gets lost with where the Patriots are at, because this year's draft, and we've talked about this, it's not as good as last year's, but it's also not barren of talent. Like, there's multiple really good to blue chip level guys. Now, is it as deep as last year where you might find those guys at 15, 20, 25? Maybe not quite that deep, but like, you could tell me that, yeah, okay, Hunter and Carter are blue chip players. Ashton Genty's a blue chip player. Tyler Warren's a blue chip player. Will Campbell is. We just don't know what position that's going to be at. So, like, there's other guys that are blue chip level players. And you mentioned the Raiders. I think that's the team, they bring in Geno Smith, but that feels more like a bridge thing for a couple of years than it does a long-term solution. So maybe they like Sanders. They want to move up at that point. There might be a surprise team, in the teens or something that even wants to jump way up and give you a lot if they really like Shadur Sanders. So I think, again, like we kind of started the show off, if Carter and Hunter are gone, yeah, it's disappointing you miss out on those two guys, but it does open up a lot of different possibilities that maybe weren't there before.
And of course, Vrabel also spoke to 98.5's Michael Felger on Monday. A couple of things that I took away from that. The Belichick question about not being from the Belichick coaching tree and him answering that question. I thought his response was pretty interesting. He made it a point to say, hey, I'm my own man. I played for Bill, but I didn't coach under Bill. So I have my own philosophy, my own view of things. I thought that response was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I would add, if you look at Belichick's coaching tree, the two guys in my mind that have had the most success, Bill O'Brien and Brian Flores, who I think was unfairly fired, are guys that, yes, spent a lot of time in the Patriots system, but of all the Bill assistants, they felt like most their own men or their own personalities. Like O'Brien spent some time in college before he went to the Patriots. He obviously went to Penn State before going to the Houston Texans. Brian Flores was basically with the Patriots his entire coaching career, but he spent some time in scouting, right? He wasn't coaching under Bill the entire time. And again, none of the guys on Bill's coaching tree have had a great amount of success, but the two guys that have had, I think, reasonable success feels like the two guys that could take what they learned from him, but also be their own men and not try to be clones of him. And I think for Vrabel, that's an important piece. Like, he played for Bill. I think his coaching style is pretty similar to Bill, just maybe a little, like, he jokes around a little bit more.
I think he's more Bill Parcells than Bill Belichick.
But and even Parcells and Belichick and Vrabel, like, the set of expectations and a lot of the approach is the same. Like, the difference is the delivery a lot of time. Like, the expectations that Parcells and Belichick had were essentially the same. It's just they would deliver that message usually in different ways. So I think it was a good thing for Vrabel, I guess, in the long run, to not coach here, because he had that playing experience here and he could go out and learn from other people, see different perspectives, see things that worked, see things that didn't work. And I think I would expect it's going to help him here now.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I like that he talked about that he is his own man, that he has his own philosophy, that it's not going to be business as usual, which I think is really refreshing. I thought the other thing that he talked about that was interesting was the fact that if he didn't have a voiceover personnel, and he said this in the media scrum as well, that if he didn't have a say over personnel or the final roster, he wouldn't be here. I thought that was awesome that he was that transparent about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't blame him, because by the time he left Tennessee, he had
not to cut you off, John. Not that we didn't know that.
Yeah.
We already knew that, but I like that he reinforced it.
Yeah, and by the time he left Tennessee, he had personnel power. So I understand him wanting it. And it's like we've talked about before. You want to strike that balance if you're Mike Vrabel, where it felt like last year, the Patriots' whole operating philosophy was, let's just do the opposite of what Bill Belichick did. And we saw you got the same 4-13 with Bill to 4-13 with Mayo. And frankly, last year, I know the record was the same, but it looked worse. So now you have Vrabel. I think he can strike that balance between taking what he learned from Belichick as a player, taking what he learned from other coaches and his own coaching experience, and then on the personnel side, not having as much power as Bill did. I don't think anyone will ever get that again, but having much more of a say and input than Gerard Mayo did. So if he can strike the balance on those two things, I think that will be a good way to kind of reset and start this new era, because you don't want to move too far away from stuff that got you to 9 Super Bowls and won 6 championships. But you also want to sprinkle in and use some new things, some new philosophies that have shown, whether it's in San Francisco, whether it's with the Rams, wherever, that have worked and have had consistent success. So I think striking that balance, to me, John, is a really important thing for Mike Vrabel. I'd add it's an important thing for Josh McDaniels as well, for Elliott Wolf as well, for those guys to strike that balance is, to me, the key of this program resetting itself and building towards the next era.
Now, of course, Wolf also took some time to meet with Felger on Monday as well. I believe it was Monday. It might have been Tuesday, but I think it was Monday. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter what it was. He met with Felger. I thought one of his first answer was pretty interesting. Felger asks him, "How is the offseason going?" And Wolf's response was, and I quote, "Different. Yeah, different. A little bit more streamlined, and communication has been good." I take a lot out of that. And I know people will say, don't read too much into that response. I read a lot into that response, Sean, because I think what that tells me is communication wasn't good with Gerard Mayo, that they weren't on the same page, that the front office and the coaching staff were not on the same page. I'm not sitting here and mincing words. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like he's just going to casually say that. I think things were bad. That's a big reason why Gerard Mayo's not here. They weren't just bad on the field. I think they were bad all around. And I think in that one opening response by Wolf to Felger's question, he basically comes out and says it, but he's trying to soften the blow. But I think that answer is pretty telling. I think it was about as straightforward as he could be, but I think it just goes to show you that the inner workings just were not functioning properly there last season.
Yeah, and I think the key word in that answer is streamlined, right? Because if you go back to
Sounds like there
last,
were a lot of voices in the room, and that goes back to the whole collaboration piece.
and what was the quote at Gerard Mayo's introductory press conference, right? We're going to knock down silos. And it felt like, okay, in theory, that can be a good thing. And
Yeah.
things probably were too siloed off at the end of Bill's time. But it felt like, again, their operating philosophy a year ago was just to do the opposite of everything Bill
Yeah.
did. And they learned pretty
Keep
quickly.
everybody in place, or as many people in place as possible. Get rid of Bill and just keep doing what we've been doing.
Yeah, just do the op, right? And so now it feels like, okay, like I said before, they're trying to strike that balance. And I think it's another subtle message that Vrabel has come in and he has set the tone and he's in charge, right? Because if it's streamlined, if there's clear communication, generally that means, John, there is someone or two people that are in charge at the top filtering everything else down. So whether that's Vrabel solo, whether that's Vrabel and Wolf, Vrabel and Cowden, but whereas last year it just felt like, and to your point, one person would say one thing, one person would say another thing. They would, say they're going to do this and end
They
up
were
doing
never on the
something
same
different.
page. You could see it.
Right. You could kind of feel that. Whereas now it definitely feels like, and we'll see how much this translates to winning games or not, but it does feel like there is a direction that everyone is going in now. Whereas last year felt like you had some people going in different directions at the same time.
And I thought his follow-up answer was pretty interesting too, where he was asked by Felger, how more streamlined when you say that? He says a little bit more. Mayo's staff was good. So right there, he's trying to deflect and say, no. Gerard was good. That wasn't the problem. Just this staff has come together and they've all worked together before. So there's been a less of a getting to know period of time, which is, in Wolf's defense, that was a big part of it. This is why the Crafts wanted the media to meet this staff. And it wasn't just for the media to meet with Mayo and the new coaching staff and get to know them. That social was also designed for the coaches in many ways to get to know each other. Because if you remember, Elliott Wolf hired that staff. The majority of the guys that came in last year under Mayo were Wolf guys. Mayo didn't have the Rolodex to go out and put a coaching staff together. So Wolf did that for him. So while I think he's being candid and honest there, and I think he's right, these guys have coached together. They know each other. There's no honeymoon period here. They're going to walk right into the building and start working. I still think it's an indictment on the way things were there last year from an operations standpoint.
And I think you got to remember, too, a lot of the coaches they hired last year, not their first choice, right? DeMarcus Covington was their first choice at DC, but a lot of, Alex
Belt wasn't. He was like their fifth choice.
Yeah, right. No disrespect. He was like their fifth. They tried like anything to get Nick Caley out of LA, and they tried other guys as well. It felt like a lot of that offense, like their receivers coach, doesn't feel like that was their first choice. You can go on down the line.
I think with Hughes, he had been here before, so I think that helped.
But it was just easy. It didn't feel like they went out and whereas this year, like McDaniels was their first choice. It feels like Terrell Williams was their first choice. Springer, I don't know if he was their first choice. Actually, he wasn't because they wanted the guy that ended up going to the Falcons, whose name I forget. But it feels like this time around, they wanted him to stay, and a lot of guys bought in. So it feels like their three coordinators are their first choice. It feels like Doug Marrone was their first choice for offensive line coach. So it feels like now a lot of these guys, and I know it might sound like a minor thing, but it's guys they targeted, they brought in together that they feel comfortable working with. And I think, to your point, that helps a lot.
Yeah, no, I think it helps a lot. And of course, owner Robert Kraft spoke with the media on Tuesday. The big story that came out of that, of course, was the announcement that Bill Parcells is going to be inducted into the Patriots Hall of Fame. Hallelujah. It's about freaking time. It's probably 10 years too late. And I know I'm not taking a victory lap here, but it's about time, John. You and I talked about this last week, and we spent a fair amount of time on the topic at the end of last week's show of Bill Parcells being in the Patriots Hall of Fame. It never made sense to me that this guy was in the NFL Hall of Fame. He's applauded for his coaching career universally across the board. Okay, so you didn't see eye to eye with him at the end. You didn't let him shop for the groceries. He was flirting with the Jets. He leaves after the Super Bowl. That leaves a bitter taste in your mouth. I get all that. But he should have been in this Patriots Hall of Fame a long time ago. And again, I'm going to sound like the old man on my porch. The Patriots were going to leave before Bushworth Wine hired him. He was going to move the team to St. Louis. Bill Parcells and Robert Kraft saved professional football in New England. Period. End of story. Bill Parcells laid the foundation for the first half of the Belichick-Brady dynasty. He didn't draft Brady, but he drafted a lot of the other key pieces that you can argue if weren't on the roster, the Patriots may not have won 3 Super Bowls in the early 2000s. So at the end of the day, this was long overdue. I love that Kraft did it. Good for him that he finally saw the writing on the wall and said, you know what? I'm 83. He's 83. We're not going to be around forever. Now's the right time to do it. Let's do it.
Yeah, and we talked on the show last week, as you mentioned, and I was totally off on this. I thought they were not going to put
So was
Parcells in.
I agreed with you. I didn't think he was going to put him in either.
Yeah, and I didn't think they were going to put Parcells in at all. And if they did, it wasn't going to be until Robert Kraft was no longer in control of the team. And by the way, go back to the Dynasty documentary, and I know there's a lot of opinions on that. Jonathan Kraft wouldn't even say his name, right, in that documentary. So, but I mean, so I feel like there was still, even at that time, animosity, and it's obviously softened since then. I am glad, though, that they did it in the contributor category because as I said last week, I didn't want him to get in over a Vinatieri or push aside an Edelman. I'm glad that it's going to be him and then one of those guys, one of those players who won Super Bowls here going in at the same time. So I think that was, and honestly, John, Parcells has been on the ballot before. The fan vote, he hasn't won. Maybe they were concerned.
Well, that's why I'm glad they put him in as a contributor, because the fans were never going to put him in. And a lot of that, with all due respect to the fans, and we love the fans, they're the reason we're doing what we're doing. But with all due respect to the fans, they had multiple opportunities to put him in. They didn't put him in. And I don't think they were ever going to put him in. And I think a lot of it was recency bias. Now, you could sit there and say Vinatieri, Edelman, all these guys are more deserving of getting in ahead of Parcells. I respectfully disagree, because Parcells drafted Vinatieri, and Parcells was a big reason why we still have the New England Patriots. Julian Edelman has made a lot of great plays, especially in the playoffs. He's been an instrumental part in the second part of the dynasty, a huge part of it. And he should be a Patriots Hall of Famer. And I think someday down the road, he probably gets into the NFL Hall of Fame. But at the end of the day, I think that leaving it up to the fans, there was some short-sightedness there. I don't think fans, especially in certain age groups, and let's face it, these are going to be the age groups, people in their 20s and 30s, that are going to do the majority of the voting anyway. It's not going to be people my age. It's not going to be people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s that were going to vote for who should get into the Patriots Hall of Fame. I don't think younger fans fully understand how much of an impact he made in the short amount of time he did here. I mean, this guy was a 2-time Super Bowl winning coach when Bushworth Wine hired him. The fact that he took this job, the fact that he took over an organization that in 2 of the last 3 years had gone 1-15 and 2-14 before his arrival, the fact that he took this job and he left NBC to take this job speaks to the fact that he wanted to be here. He wanted the challenge of rebuilding this franchise, and he, along with Robert Kraft, who purchased the team a year later in 1994, saved football in New England. And like I said, I'm glad to see that he finally came around and he's putting him in, long overdue.
Yeah, and I feel like he, in his time here, legitimized the Patriots. Like you mentioned,
Yes.
save them, right? Like, because they go to the Super Bowl in 85, right? They win that AFC championship game in Miami, but they got smoked by the Bears. And after that, it was a steady decline. You mentioned 1-15, 2-14 in previous, years prior to his arrival. So he comes in, and all of a sudden, you're at least a team that is, legitimate and has to be reckoned with. And then they build themselves up within a few years to they're in the Super Bowl. And I think
And I
really,
think,
John,
not to cut you off, but I think another thing that's important to point out here, John, they were on their third owner in 6 years when he came here.
yeah.
I think people forget that.
And I think too, and the merits of him getting in, I don't think a lot of people argue that. I think if it had ended better, like if he had just retired, or even if they had fired him, right, or if they had won that Super Bowl against the Packers and then he left, he probably would have gotten in 10 or 12 years ago, right? But it just,
Yeah.
I think the ending had more to do with it than anything else. Because when you look at the merits of the case, yeah, the guy, I mean, he legitimized your franchise. He made you a lot better, got you to a Super Bowl, helped lay the seeds for the dynasty that you had. So I think the merits are there. And like I said, I stand by. I didn't want him to get in over Vinatieri or over Edelman, but I think he deserves to be in. And I think if it ended better, he probably would have gotten in a decade ago.
Yeah, well, we can't always agree on everything, my friend. So
That's true.
there you go. You are watching Patriots Pulse. I'm your host, John Sarianides. As always, I'm joined by WEEI's John Lyons. We've got a few minutes left here on the show. Josh McDaniels told the world on Thursday that he is, quote, smitten with Drake May. In your estimation, John Lyons, how smitten do you really think Josh McDaniels is with Drake May? Is he that smitten with him? Or is this part of the early PR campaign to show Patriot fans that, hey, Josh McDaniels is happy to be back. He's here for the long haul. He's excited to work with the young quarterback. Or am I just being an a-hole by saying all this and he truly, really is smitten with him?
I think he is. And I think if you gave Josh truth serum, he would look around and say,
By the way, where do people buy truth serum? Because I hear that expression all the time. Is it readily available? Can you get it online?
I think you can get it at Walmart. But
You can.
if
Okay.
you gave it to him,
Target has it too.
yeah, probably. I think he would look around and say, "Man, I can't believe this dude survived last year, let alone had
Yeah.
some good moments." Like,
Yeah.
like with what
Yeah.
they had there. So I think he's, and I think when you look at how he's going to use Drake May, and Josh talked about his time away from football and adjusting his scheme a little bit. The more I think about it, the more I look at that 2008 year with Matt Castle. And I think Drake May is obviously more talented than Matt Castle. But of all the quarterbacks that Josh worked with outside of Cam Newton, Matt Castle probably had the most balance between being able to throw on the run, being able to run the ball, and just being a pocket passer as well. So I think it's going to be really similar to what they did in 2008, which, by the way, they won 11 games. Matt Castle's the only Patriots quarterback in team history to throw for 400 yards in back-to-back games. So, like, it ended up working out well. They started slowly, if you remember. His first game in week 2, they beat the Jets 19-10. They didn't ask him to do a lot. But again, as the season went on, they did more and more. And I think Josh looks at it with, yeah, my offense is a little bit different than it was then. We're not as talented as we were then, but we can kind of build things out like we did in 2008. And obviously, a lot of people compare it to 2021 with Mac Jones as well. But I think the bonus is this guy in Drake May is much more talented than Matt Castle. He's much more talented than Mac Jones. And at this stage, he's a better quarterback than what Josh had with Cam Newton in 2020 because Newton's shoulder wasn't the same anymore. So if I were Josh, and I think Josh is really into working with Drake May, and I don't know, I see a potential for a lot of success.
Yeah, no, I do too. Now, again, a lot of it will depend on how much this offense is going to change. I still think a lot of the elements that we saw during the second half of the dynasty, the Brady Edelman years, the Gronk years, I think a lot of those elements of that system are still going to be in place. I still think that they're going to emphasize the slot. They're going to use a tight end a lot more on vertical routes. They're going to do a lot with empty formations and motion and moving people around to create favorable matchups. I think they're going to do more with their personnel. They're going to be more diverse, which I love. Vrabel talked about that on Monday. The number one thing that he talked about that I loved is the fact that they're going to be multiple. You're going to see multiple backs, multiple tight ends. That's the way offensive football should be played because you want to generate matchups. I don't want the modern West Coast offense. I don't give two shits about RPOs. I don't care about over the top window dressing. I don't care about any of that. What I want is to play hockey on grass, not basketball on grass. I want to use personnel and create matchups and use formations and put a defense in conflict. You don't put a defense in conflict with RPOs. Spread guys think you do. They're full of it. You don't. It's an element of your offense, but it can't be your entire offense, especially in the NFL. So, with all that being said, I love that he said that. And I think that's where he's going to help Drake May, because he's going to take pressure off of him. They're going to run the football. They're going to use all of their pieces the way they should. Diggs, Hollins, Henry, Hooper, Stevenson. They're going to move these guys around. They're going to create matchups, but they're going to add that RPO element to the offense. They're going to add the possibility of the quarterback run game, designed quarterback run game to the offense. So there's a lot to like here. You kept hearing about Nick Caley and all these other possible candidates, Thomas Brown interviews for the job. I don't want a Sean McVay disciple. I don't. I'm sorry. I wasn't enamored with Caley coming back here last year. I don't want to sit in 11 personnel all day. Sean McVay can do that because he knows his system, and he had Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua and Kyron Williams. And when you have three really good receivers, a good tight end like Tyler Higbee, and a good zone running back, you can do that. But the Patriots are not built that way. And I didn't want them to do that. So I agree with you. I think he is going to be good for Drake May. Even though I was being an ass about it a couple of minutes ago, I do think he's genuinely happy about getting the opportunity to coach May. And now we got to see May take that next step, right? He's got to take that next step in his development. And a lot of that obviously will depend upon what they do with him moving forward. Of course, the voluntary program begins tomorrow. So you assume May's in town. He was in North Carolina this weekend hanging out with Belichick. But you assume he's going to be in town and be a part of the program. We're going to start to see just how many players are in and how many are buying in. My guess is the majority of the team will be here. And we're going to finally start to see the pieces come together, especially on offense.
Yeah, and I think the focus with May and McDaniels early on and throughout the season is going to be the limiting of negative plays, right? And that was the one knock on May.
That's the biggest drawback to this kid right now is the amount of negative plays he generates.
Yeah, I mean, he was essentially an interception per game, player, which is unacceptable in the full NFL season. And I think if they can take all the good things he did last year and limit the negative plays, and I talked to Drake May on EEI at the end of the season, and he told me that the biggest thing he wanted to improve was seeing his checkdowns more and going to his checkdowns more and limiting some of those negative plays. So he's aware of it. I know that's going to be a big thing for McDaniels, and you've seen it in all the years McDaniels was here, and their offense is good. And this is with
Don't
Castle.
mind me, I'm spilling on myself.
That's with Castle, with Brady, with Garoppolo, Brissett, Mac Jones, whoever it was. One of the hallmarks was they would have very few negative plays. Like how many times, and look, we have plenty of criticisms of Mac Jones, and he ended up not being a good player. But you go back to 2021, once you got like 5 or 6 weeks in, he really didn't make that many negative plays. And I'm not telling you he was an all-pro, but he wasn't making negative plays. And I think that's a really important thing for Drake May as he builds this offseason, is limiting those negative plays. I mean, look, I talked about this on EEI this week. You could make the case that Colts game, if he doesn't throw an interception in the end zone, they might win that game. And there was an interception at the end of the Rams game, an interception in overtime against the Titans. Again, key negative plays that hurt them in games. And I'm well aware that if not for him, they wouldn't have even been in those games. But I think if he works to eliminate those, you're going to start seeing those close losses from last year, at least some of them, flip to wins.
Yeah. No, I agree. And of course, as I mentioned, the Patriots do begin their voluntary offseason program tomorrow. So it is hard to believe. Before you know it, we'll have OTAs, mini camp, and then we'll have a little bit of time off before the season kicks off. It's crazy. All right, last segment of the show here. Let's talk some defensive tackle edge guys real quick for the upcoming draft. Of course, Patriots signed Milton Williams, which is huge. Looks like Christian Barmore is healthy and he'll be back. So the two of them should form a pretty formidable interior defensive line. But the Patriots still lack depth there. They need more bodies. They added Tonga in free agency as well. He's going to help. But I still think they're an interior defensive lineman short. For me, I don't see them addressing this position early. I would love someone like Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss. But, I think if they do end up addressing this position, it'll more than likely be day 3. Perhaps someone like Boston College's Cam Horsley could be in the mix. Horsley had a terrific 3-year run at BC. I think he'd be a nice scheme fit for them as a one-gap type of defensive tackle who can reset the line of scrimmage. Vernon Broughton out of Texas is another name that comes to mind for me. Jordan Birch is kind of a hybrid sub-package, 3 technique, 5 technique kind of guy. He's got some length. He's a defensive end a la Dietrich Wise. He could potentially be in play for them as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a day 3 thing, and I know that in Terrell Williams' system, it sounds like it's just going to be a single gap, penetrate, get up the field thing. I still want a guy, John, though, in that room that's a big run stuffing type defensive tackle because you're going to need it. Because Barmore is good against the run, and I think Milton Williams, he wasn't great against the run last year. Maybe he'll be a little bit better this year, and Spillane will help behind them against the run. But they don't have, to me, that really big physical the guy that you are not going to be able to run against. So that's something. And I think, honestly, John, this is going to be that 5th round pick they got in the Milton trade or one of their 7th round picks or something like that and an undrafted free agent. They're not going to invest highly in it because in the last 2 off seasons, they've invested almost $200 million total in Milton Williams and Christian Barmore combined. So they're not going to invest high draft capital, but I do want them to bring in 1 or 2 guys, especially at least one that's kind of that bigger run stuffing type.
Well, and a guy that comes to mind is a guy that they've met with is Deion Walker from Kentucky. You're talking about a guy who's 6'7", 340. He can be that guy. I mean, he is massive. He can be that guy. And another guy, and I do think they're going to place a premium on scheme versatility. They're going to want guys that can play the 3 tech, that can play the 5 tech, that can move around in the front. That's going to be important to them, not just with their edge guys, but also with their interior defensive linemen. Derek Harmon, another guy that I think fits that profile of what you're talking about. More than he's out of Oregon, by the way, more of a 3 tech at 6'5", 305. He's another guy that you can potentially keep an eye on. Malik Williams and Ty Hamilton, both out of Ohio State, guys that I really like. That those are your space eater types that can really absorb blocks, 2 gap, and anchor down. And another guy, and I unfortunately I think he's going to be long gone by the time they do address the position. Kenneth Grant out of Michigan. He really fits what you're asking for. That big space eater that can play a 0 nose in 30 fronts. He can also play a 2-eye or a shade in 40 fronts. So those are some of the interior defensive linemen. They have met and spoken with some of these guys, but those are some of the guys that you can expect will be in play for them day 3. Now, I still think Abdul Carter, if he's sitting on the board, it's a strong likelihood he's the pick at 4 if he's still there. Because, again, I hate to harp on it. We saw it in the Super Bowl. You can never have enough premium pass rushers. I think they're going to add one early. If they don't add one at pick 4, I can see them taking one day 2. I don't think they're done shopping for pass rushers, John. I think they're going to take one in this draft, and I think they're going to take one relatively early.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to edge guys, okay, they bring in Harold Landry, they have Anthony Jennings, they have guys there.
They signed Chase on.
Right. I think the key question is Keon White, because I think Keon White, to me, 6'5", 285, good speed, good power. He can rush inside, which they did a little bit towards the end of last season. He can rush outside. I think he could be a really productive player for Mike Vrabel. So if they view him as a guy that they believe in like I do, then I don't think they're going to address edge guy outside of Abdul Carter being there. I don't think they'll address edge guy till day 3. If they don't believe in Keon White as much, then I think you might see one of those day 2 picks being an edge player. Who knows? Maybe we'll be anyway. But I think Carter's the wild card. If he's there, I think it's, decent chance they take him. But if he's not there and they believe in Keon White, I think it might be early day 3, but a day 3 thing.
I think that they're going to take another one. That's my feeling on it. I think they're going to take another one. I think, in my view, like I said, that Super Bowl opened a lot of people's eyes. Talking to scouts around the league, this is a very strong defensive tackle, edge, defensive end class, as good as we've seen in the last 10 years. And I think a lot of teams, especially after what happened in the Super Bowl, especially in the AFC, where you have to deal with Mahomes and you have to deal with Allen and Burrow and Herbert, you need guys that can get after the quarterback. And I think that Vic Fangio gave the rest of the league a blueprint. And I think teams are going to capitalize on this defensive tackle, this edge class. They're going to load up on those guys. And a lot of these guys, John, in my opinion, are going to go a lot earlier. Some of them are going to go a lot earlier than they might have in other years, because I do think there's more of an emphasis on it now. I could see them taking an edge rusher in day 2 early. If they go offensive line at pick 4, let's say they do take Will Campbell, I could see them using one of those 3rd-round picks on an edge rusher. Now, look, Donovan Ezeraku, Mike Green, those guys are going to be off the board. They're probably not going to take one of those guys unless they trade back into the 1st round. But I could see a Princely you out of Ole Miss being in play in round 3 potentially. There's a lot of talent at that position. And I think, again, you got a lot of guys, too, that are raw, like Nick Skirton from Texas A&M. These are guys that – Stewart is another one from Texas A&M. These are guys that have a lot of ability, but they're raw. But you mentioned Keon White. They're built similar to him. They could do a lot of different things. I think they're going to add another guy that can come off the edge. I don't think they're done. And the reason I think that is again, you're in the AFC. You need as many pass rushers as possible when going up against these elite level quarterbacks.
Yeah, and I agree with you that they're going to add him. I just think they're going to do it later on. But the way the draft shakes out with these edge guys is interesting because it feels like a pretty deep edge rusher class.
It's a very deep edge rusher class.
To your point, partly because of the Super Bowl, partly because of the premium on the position, just because it's deep, you can't really wait till the 6th or 7th round. Like, I think it's a 4th or 5th round thing because, again, I think I agree with you. I think a lot of these guys might end up going earlier. Like, I mean, obviously Carter's a top 5 pick, but Mike Green, James Pierce, Ezeraku, Mikael Williams, like those could all be 1st round picks. So then all of a sudden, yes, it's a deep class, but they still could, many of them go in the first couple days.
Well, that's just it. Again, I think to me, it's unless you're willing to trade back into the 1st round, I don't see them doing that. If they go tackle at 4, I don't see them doing that, but you never know. You never know. You have the draft capital. You have 3 picks in day 2. So you're going to have the ammunition if you want to. If there's a player there you really like, you're going to have the ammo to move back into the 1st round and possibly take a guy. And look, if that happens, and let's say, again, they go offensive tackle at 4, if they trade back into the 1st round, right, what are you doing it for? To take another offensive tackle? Maybe. I don't see that being the case, though. So if you were to trade back into the 1st round, hypothetically, why are you doing it?
Right.
And I think it's 2 positions. It's either edge or wide receiver, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I was going to say receiver. Like, if you trade back up, and then obviously if Carter's there at 4 and you take him, then you can trade back up into the 1st round to get that tackle at pick 29, 30, 31. So he has that 5th-year option too. But yeah, I think that's going to depend. And we talked about this on last week's show, and we've talked about it before. A lot of their draft strategy to me comes down to what do they think of those late 1st, early 2nd round offensive tackles? Because if they don't like those guys, they're going to have to take one in the top 10. If they do like those guys, it gives them more flexibility in the top 10, and it even gives them some flexibility to move around in that late 1st, early 2nd round. But to me, that is kind of the underrated but quintessential question to me of this draft is what do they think of those late 1st, early 2nd round tackles?
And I've said this before, and I've been on record as saying, and I'm going to say it again, I would take an offensive tackle with their first 2 picks. I would. I know a lot of Patriot fans probably are going to look at me and say, what the hell are you talking about, Fred Flintstone? But I would. That's the reality, man, because you need a left tackle, but you need a right tackle too, John. Morgan Moses is a Band-Aid. He's on a 3-year, $24 million deal. It's a very easy deal if you're not happy with his play. Obviously, we saw at his press conference, he's going to bring in a lot from the leadership standpoint. But if you're not happy with his play, you can move off of that contract after year 1. Why not use pick 38? If Ozzie Trapillo's in there, and I'm not pumping the tires of the local guy, I know they like him. I've talked to people that have told me they like him. If that's the case, why not take a Will Campbell at 4, especially because eventually you may have to kick him inside the left guard, and why not take a right tackle who could swing to left tackle potentially at 38. And if Trapillo's there, he's the one guy that can do that. Watching him at his pro day, Dante Scarnecchia has done a wonderful job with getting him to bend better, playing with better pad leverage, sustain blocks more. He has improved as a run blocker. We know the athleticism and the length are there in terms of the pass blocking. Yes, his arms aren't as long as people would like, but I'm not opposed to taking 2 offensive tackles with those first 2 picks, because if Drake May is the future of your franchise, and let's face it, he is, you got to protect him. I think it makes a ton of sense. The hell with conventional logic, conventional wisdom, logic, whatever the hell you want to say. Take the 2 tackles.
Yeah, and it's an interesting theory, and I think the key here is you need to come out of the first 2 rounds with your offensive tackle of the future, whether that's a guy at 4, a guy at a trade down, a guy in the second round, even if you take 2, whatever. You need to come out of it, because, I mean, how many years have we been saying this, John, where they've needed a left tackle going in? This is like the 3rd year in a row we've done shows about this, right?
Yep.
So, like, you need to come out of the first 2 rounds of the draft with your left tackle of the future. And it has to be, and this is stating the obvious, but it has to be a hit, right? It can't be a
Yes.
Cole Strange type whiff or a Caden Wallace that doesn't have an impact in year 1. It's going to have to be a left tackle of the future who has an impact in year 1 as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out Vidarian Lowe going into the last year of his contract. Trey Jacobs, you only brought him back for 1 year. Yes, you signed Morgan Moses to a 3-year deal, but again, it's a pretty easy deal to get out of if he's not playing to the level you're hoping he's going to play. So I'm all in on addressing that position for now and in the future. I think you take tackles with your first 2 picks. And then the rest of the draft, in many ways, John, is a luxury for you. You can address running back. You can add another tight end. You can add another receiver. You can add another corner. Like, you can go in a myriad of directions after that. But offensive tackle, too important not to address. All right, final thoughts here before we wrap it up.
So, I mean, for me, really, it feels like the draft is starting to crystallize a little bit. It seems like the Titans are in on Cam Ward. You're getting the increasing feeling that Hunter and Carter are going to be gone by pick 4. And I think that crystallization, though, as I said to start the show, does kind of open up some interesting possibilities for the Patriots. And look, obviously missing out on Abdul Carter would be a disappointment, but now they could take Campbell at 4. They could take another left tackle at 4. They could go Tet McMillan. They could go Mason Graham. They could trade that. Like, it's just, I think there's a lot more possibilities that are in play than maybe we thought there were a week or 2 ago.
Yeah. And my final thought is I do want to point out that the Patriots did have several local prospects in for workouts on Thursday. It's a long list, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, obviously. But Ozzie Trapillo did come in and work out for the team on Thursday at their local pro day, where they brought in local prospects to work them out in person. Couple of other guys to keep an eye on, though, that were on that list. New Hampshire edge Josiah Silver, one of the best defensive players in the CAA the last 2 years and one of the best defensive players in FCS football. He worked out for them in person as well, as did Trayshawn Ward, Jake Wilcox, and Seth Morgan, both quarterbacks. Wilcox, of course, from Everett, played at Milton Academy in Brown. He worked out for them, as did Seth Morgan, who had a really good year at UNH, good-sized quarterback at about 6'3", 215, played in a West Coast offense, so he has some experience playing in a pro-style offense. He worked out for them as well. And a couple of other guys to keep an eye on, Jacob Dobbs, who played at Holy Cross, 4-year starter, transferred to James Madison and followed Bob Chesney last year, had a really good year for the Dukes. He also worked out for them. And Wande Owens, who was a multi-year starter at Yale, captain, transfers to UNH last year. He worked out for them as well. So those are some local names to keep an eye on for the Patriots in regards to possible priority free agents. Most of these guys are probably 7th-round picks / priority undrafted free agents. They'll be in play for the Patriots. I would not be surprised if the majority of this list ends up in rookie minicamp with the Patriots following the draft. All right. John, thanks for taking the time. I know you're going to be on WEEI later on, and of course, you'll be on a bunch this week. So make sure you tune into WEEI to listen to John when he's on there. He does great, great work, and I'm not just saying it because he's my partner. It's true. He does terrific work at EI. So make sure you're following him on X, on all social media platforms, including Instagram, and listen to him on WEI. Let's do this again next week. It'll be the Palm Sunday edition.
Yes, Palm Sunday edition of Draft Talk. That's what God intended, right?
Yes, the Palm Sunday edition of Draft Talk. All right, well, that'll do it for this week's episode of Patriots Pulse. For John Lyons, I'm John Sarianides. Till next week, peace.